If you love Rearview Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Hockton. I'd like you to picture this. It's early morning in West Yorkshire. The year is 1820. The mist clings to the fields, soft and low. The sky already threatening rain. You're standing at the edge of Hawthorne village. A scatter of stone houses blackened by the soot from 100 household fires, huddled around a small grey church. And there, at the very end of a cobbled lane, you see it, the parsonage. If you walk up the path, your boots crunching on loose gravel, you'll see the Brontë children peering out of the window. 6 of them. Restless, serious, hair wild from the wind, watching as their father, Patrick Brontë, strides back from the graveyard, coat billowing, his mind already racing ahead of the next sermon. Patrick, I don't think, is what you'd expect. He's Irish, full of pride and unpredictable warmth, with a taste of poetry and a secret longing for greatness. He's changed the family name from Brontë to Brontë, a little grander, a little more mysterious. In the evenings, he reads his sermons aloud by candlelight, the words hanging in the air long after the flame has died. Maria, his wife, is from Cornwall. Imagine her, soft-spoken, quick to smile, her accent a gentle lilt in a house full of Yorkshire thunder. She's come hundreds of miles from the salt-sprayed cliffs of Penzance to this harsh northern village, carrying with her a love of stories and a stack of family letters bound with ribbon, and she's determined to make the parsonage a home, even as the rain leaks through the roof and the coal fire sputters in the hearth. The house would have been cramped but always full. There's Maria, the eldest, already thoughtful beyond her years. Elizabeth, quieter, always trailing her big sister. Charlotte, small and intense, eyes bright with mischief. Branwell, the only boy, already dreaming large. And of course, Emily, with her wild hair and stubborn silence. And last but not least, Anne, just a baby, blinking at the world with open wonder. It's a household bustling with noise, footsteps on the stairs, snatches of song, a clatter of dishes, the shriek of wind outside. There's laughter too. The Brontës play games, they tell stories, they invent strange new words, and race each other through the graveyard, dodging the ancient stones. The sky above is always changing. It's Yorkshire after all. Grey then blue, then stormy again. I think there's a sense even then that this is a place at the edge of the world where anything might happen and everything could. But there's another edge too, the edge of disaster. For all their dreams, the Brontës live in a world where illness waits at every corner. Within a year of moving to Walworth, Maria, mother, anchor, heart of the family, falls ill. The illness creeps in slowly like fog through a broken window. The house grows quieter. The children tiptoe around the room, listening to the soft murmur of prayers, the sound of their father's voice grown rough with worry. Maria's death is a blow that no one in the family ever truly recovers from, and she leaves behind not just her husband and 6 children, but I imagine also a kind of silence, an empty chair at the table, a lull in the music, a shadow over every story told after dark. Yet even in the midst of grief, the Brontës carry on. Patrick, grieving but determined, brings in Maria's sister, Aunt Branwell from Cornwall. She's strict with sharp Cornish vowels and a talent for strong tea. She brings, I imagine, a sense of order to the chaos, and in time, a small inheritance that will change the girls' fortunes. But the wildness never leaves the house. The children roam the moors, shoes soaked through, inventing kingdoms, whispering secrets, and always, always watching the sky. Let me pause here, and I'd like you to imagine the Brontë girls in their Sunday best. Dresses patched and mended, boots scuffed, eyes wide as they set off for school. Patrick, ever ambitious, wants them to have more than just a village education. He sends Maria, Elizabeth, and Charlotte and Emily to the Clergy Daughters' School at Cowan Bridge, a very grim institution on the edge of Lancashire, perched on the banks of a muddy stream. If you were to step into the dining hall at Cowan Bridge, you'd see rows of shivering girls, heads bowed over bowls of grey, cold porridge. The walls drip with damp, the windows would have rattled with every gust of wind. The teachers are stern, sometimes cruel, and discipline comes always before compassion. Charlotte wrote that she would never forget it. She writes years later about the hunger, the cold, the long walks to church in shoes too thin for winter. But the worst is the sickness. The fever sweeps through the school like wildfire, sparing no one. Maria and Elizabeth, so full of promise, are among the first to fall ill. Charlotte and Emily are pulled home just in time. Maria and Elizabeth never recover. Their deaths haunt the Brontes. Charlotte especially will revisit those halls of suffering again and again in her fiction. Lowood School in Jane Eyre is Cowan Bridge, with the serial numbers barely filed off. The cruel Miss Scratchard, the martyr Helen Burns, the smell of sickness and death. And yet from misery comes, I think, something absolutely remarkable. Back in Haworth, the surviving children draw even closer. The parsonage becomes both fortress and theatre, a place where grief and creativity live side by side. In the evenings, they gather by the fire, their faces flickering in the candlelight, telling stories that spill out into the dark. I absolutely believe that it's here that the Brontë legend is really born. Branwell is given a set of wooden soldiers, tiny, chipped, easily lost beneath the furniture. But in the hands of the Brontes, these toy soldiers become gods. Each child claims a few, names them, and gives them histories more elaborate than anything in their schoolbooks. They invent kingdoms, Angria, Gondor, Glasstown. These are not just games, they are full-scale, ongoing epics with family trees and betrayals and wars and romances that last for absolutely years, full of political intrigue and melodrama. I like to imagine them on a winter's evening, Charlotte reading aloud the latest chapter, Emily scrawling poems on scraps of paper, Anne humming quietly to herself as she draws a map. Branwell is always restless, and he would throw out wild plot twists and then wander off to sketch the scene in watercolor. It would have been noisy, messy, but you know what? It would have been entirely their own. This is not a quiet, pious Victorian household. Absolutely not. It's closer to a writer's room or a creative commune, a young salon, if you like, where ideas would have been flying, tempers would have been flaring, siblings arguing over who gets the best hero or the most tragic ending. And in the process, what they are doing is teaching themselves everything they need to know about writing, how to build a world, and how to hold a reader, and how to survive heartbreak. Haworth, I think, is a place like no other. Just step outside with me for a moment into the world that made the Brontes. The village of Haworth is perched on a ridge above the Worth Valley. The air is sharp, the hills roll away into purple heather and golden grass, and at dawn, the mist lies heavy in the hollows, and by the evening, the wind would rustle through the gravestones in the churchyard. I can't imagine that this would have been an easy place to live. Water came from a spring that ran right below the graveyard. I like to think of it as an accidental broth that brought death into every cup of tea. Life expectancy here was so low that in some years, half the children died before the age of 6. To the Brontes, these moors were not bleak. They were wild, they were free, they were a place where anything and everything could happen. Emily especially felt the pull of the open land, and she would vanish for hours, sometimes days, wandering with the family dogs, finding stories in the wind and the rain. Charlotte remembered Emily as stronger than a man, simpler than a child. Her nature stood alone. And I love that quote. and too loved the outdoors. She and Emily were inseparable companions, as Charlotte friend Ellen Newsey recalled. Together they explored every single hollow and hill, weaving their landscape into their invented worlds. And Haworth itself was a character in the Brontë story. The parsonage stood at the very top of the village, looking down on a ribbon of stone houses, the black line of the railway, the ever-shifting sky. And at night, the only light came from oil lamps and the glimmer of candles in the windows. In winter, the snow piled up against the door, and I would imagine that the wind found every crack in the walls. But inside, the parsonage was alive with creativity. The sisters wrote at the dining table, surrounded by stacks of paper, ink stains, and the smell of baking bread. Aunt Branwell would have watched over them, strict but proud, and I imagine she sometimes scolded them, sometimes encouraged them, and provided them with the backbone that they needed. Charlotte, ever the organizer, made sure everyone had time to write. Emily was more private, often working in secret, her poems hidden in drawers or tucked behind books. Anne was the steady one, always working quietly, always pushing the boundaries of what a lady could write. It's literally worlds within worlds, writing, work, and ambition, isn't it? So let's step back inside the parsonage. Imagine it's evening and the light is golden. The sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, are gathered around the scarred wooden table. Each had their own ink pot, scraps of paper, and again the comforting aroma of something baking in the kitchen. The wind howls against the window, and if you listen closely, you might hear a snippet of French. Charlotte practicing for the day that she'll go to the continent, or Anne softly reading a psalm in the fire's flicker. But look, I don't want to romanticize this too much. When you're talking about the Brontës, it's sometimes hard not to. I think the Brontës wrote not just for the love of it, because they had to. For all the imagination in the parsonage, real life crept in, bills, dwindling savings, the relentless pressures for the girls to make something of themselves in a world that gave them very few precious chances. And I think each one knew that education was their only ladder. And they taught themselves Latin and Greek. They raided their father's library and they devoured whatever books Aunt Branwell could provide. Still, it was never enough. The only respectable path, clever but poor women, was teaching or serving as a governess. I suppose a sort of liminal servant, not quite family, not quite staff. Charlotte's eventual stint as governess was a trial by fire. Children running wild, employers who alternated between condescension and suspicion. She actually tried twice, first with the Sedgwick family and then at Upper Woodhouse. Both times she found herself stifled, denied the chance to shape young minds. And she was always an outsider in another family's home. And you can hear the ache of it in Jane Eyre, that almost yearning for dignity, for real connection. Anne, the quietest, faced her own gauntlet at Blake Hall. She was just 19 and charged with teaching unruly children who, in her words, were so spoiled and unmanageable that I could do nothing with them. Her time there was so bruising that she transformed it, almost word for word, into the bleak world of Agnes Grey, her first novel. There's a moment in the book where Agnes realizes that her position, unloved, unthanked, utterly powerless, mirrors the fate of so many women in Victorian England. And Anne, I don't think, ever flinched from telling the truth. Emily, for her part, lasted barely 5 months at Law Hill School before retreating home, her health frayed by the relentless hours. She found solace always in the moors, her spirit too wild, her genius, I think, too private to be caged by a timetable or a headmistress's rules. Then came Brussels. But before we head to Brussels, let's take a short break and a message from our sponsor. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 1249 37270, or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back with Brussels. Picture Charlotte and Emily, suitcases in hand, stepping off the mail coach into foreign cobblestones. The air would have been thick with the sense of roasting chestnuts and pipe smoke. It's the 1840s, and for two daughters of a Yorkshire clergyman, this is another planet. It's strange languages, it's bustling markets, the thunder of Catholic masses in vast candlelit churches. They've come to study at Madame Heger's girls' boarding school, I suppose in hope of one day opening their own school back home. Emily is homesick from the start, and she endures the routine, French grammar, music, composition, but counts the days until she can return. Charlotte, on the other hand, finds herself caught up in the electricity of Europe. She soaks in the culture, she walks the boulevards, and I think inevitably falls in kind of impossible love with Monsieur Heger, her teacher, her mentor, and fatefully a married man. Charlotte's letters from Brussels still vibrate with longing. I felt as if I would die if I could not see you again. She's torn, yearning for Heger's approval, the lights and the conversation of Brussels, and yet always she's haunted by home, her sisters, the Moors. And I think it's a triangle of devotion, of art and ambition and the pull of family. Brussels actually changes Charlotte forever. You can hear it in the voice of Villette. Its melancholy, its fierce independence, its sense of love as both redemption and risk. But it doesn't last forever, and soon the sisters are back in Haworth, and the rhythm of life there resumes. Writing, walking, endless cycles of domestic work. Emily finds peace in the little things, baking bread, feeding the dogs, music filling the house at dusk. She sketches the cats in the margins of her notebooks, and she lovingly writes poems that no one will ever read until years after her death. And the gentle one proves to be made of quiet steel. She takes another governess's post with the Robinsons, an experience that will later ignite the scandal, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. A novel, I think, that is so bold, so unflinching about alcoholism and marital cruelty that Victorian society really tries to bury it, and actually responds with a preface that's pure Brontë. All I want is to do good and to tell the truth. I love that. Charlotte, on the other hand, is the hub of the wheel, always writing letters, dozens every month, to friends, to publishers, to would-be suitors. She plans, she edits, she pushes her sisters. And she is driven by a sense that time is running out, that genius, if not given its due, will actually die in the darkness. And I think this creative furnace is how the Brontes wrote. Let's just pause for a moment and picture the sisters at work. Forget the image of lonely geniuses in candlelit garrets. The reality was actually louder, messier, and more collective. The Brontes wrote at the dining room table, elbow to elbow, the fire hissing behind them in the grate, Aunt Branwell's footsteps creaking overhead. There were interruptions, there was baking, there was cleaning, and endless rounds of housework. But the writing always resumed. It's incredible. Sometimes they read aloud to each other, arguing over a phrase or a plot twist. Other times they worked in near silence, the only sounds, the scratching of pens and the ticking of the clock. They shared their drafts, they critiqued each other's work, and I think crucially they provided encouragement in a world that offered them precious little. Charlotte's friend Ellen Nussey once described the three sisters as pacing round the table, reading, writing, sewing, and thinking all at once. I think the creative energy there was palatable, a kind of a low, steady hum that would have filled the house from morning until that last candle spluttered out. And of course, then there was the leap into print and pseudonyms and poetry. Eventually, the pressure to publish became too strong to ignore. But in a world that really sneered at lady novelists, the Brontë sisters knew that they had to disguise themselves. Charlotte actually became Cura Bell, Emily was Ellis Bell, and Anne chose Acton Bell. Why? The names were deliberately androgynous, offering a layer of protection and, as Charlotte later put it, to avert prejudice. Their first book, a collection of poetry, was a flop, selling just a handful of copies. The world really wasn't ready, it seemed, for the peculiar music of Emily's verse or, the sweet pathos of Anne's. Still, something had shifted. The sisters had tasted publication, and once that bell's rung, it can never be unrung. Undeterred, they turned to fiction. Charlotte, with typical audacity, wrote The Professor, based on her time in Brussels. It was rejected by publisher after publisher, 9 times in all. But of course, the real breakthrough came with her next manuscript, Jane Eyre. And I think what you then see is a Brontë blitz. And I think there's 3 novels that then shook the world. Picture the autumn of 1847. All 3 sisters, unknown, unpublished as novelists, send out their manuscripts to the world. The result? An explosion. Jane Eyre, a complete sensation, devoured by readers across England and America. Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey are published together to I have to say, a chorus of confusion and outrage, and of course, eventually admiration. Reviewers, I would say, were baffled. Who are the Bell brothers? No one can believe that such ferocity, such passion, such biting social critique could come from women, let alone from a single family in a remote Yorkshire village. Some critics are vicious, especially towards Wuthering Heights. Emily actually keeps their reviews in a desk drawer, reading and rereading them in private. Anne's Agnes Grey draws praise for its honesty, while Jane Eyre is hailed as the most interesting book of the season. The Brontës have arrived. This is the important thing, and nothing, not even the next wave of tragedy, can erase their mark. And I think tragedy's return, loss, grief, and survival for the Brontës is imperative. Just as the sisters' fame begins to spread, tragedy strikes again. Branwell, their only brother, spirals into drink and opiates, his promise undone by scandal and sorrow, and he dies in September 1848, leaving the family reeling. Emily, who loved him despite everything, sickens almost at once. Tuberculosis moves in quickly, but her strength is actually legendary. But even she cannot fight it. She refuses medicine, she refuses to complain, and she dies in December, barely 3 months after Branwell. Anne is already frail, and she's the next to fall. She lingers through the winter, determined to see the sea at Scarborough one last time. And she dies in May 1849, her sister Charlotte at her side. Charlotte is now alone, and she mourns and she writes and she keeps the memory of her siblings alive. She finishes Shirley and then Villette, pouring her pain into every single page. And she actually writes hundreds of letters. She walks the moors constantly. I can only imagine talking to the ghosts of those she once loved. And of course, for her, I think there's a flicker of happiness. There's love and, of course, the final curtain. Arthur Bell Nicholas, her father's curate, finally proposes marriage. His first proposal, however, is a disaster, and Charlotte refuses. And I think really, if you read into it, what she's afraid of is leaving her father alone. But Arthur persists, and they marry in June 1854, the church bells hailing across the moor. And look, their marriage is short, but it's happy. They travel to Ireland, they walk by the sea, and Charlotte writes of a still happiness too deep for smiles and too dear for words. But of course, Haworth's shadow returns. Less than a year after her wedding, Charlotte also falls ill. Most likely, it's tuberculosis. And if it's not that, it's certainly complications from pregnancy, and she dies in March 1855 with Arthur by her side. And just like that, story ends. Or does it? Because here's the thing. Step outside the parsonage today into those wild open moors and listen. I've done it, and it gave me goosebumps. And I stood there waiting to hear it. And what you hear is the wind through the grass, the distant cry of a curlew, the echo of laughter from a kitchen where stories were spun. And I think the world that the Brontes made is still there, as vivid and as raw as the day that they wrote it. And here's the other amazing thing. Their books have never been out of print. Their characters, Jane, Heathcliff, Cathy, Helen, I think are as alive now as they were in the flicker of candlelight over 2 centuries ago. And every year, thousands, like me, make their own pilgrimage to Haworth, to stand where the sisters stood, to walk the same paths, to imagine for a moment what it meant to create worlds from absolutely nothing but grief, grit, and I think also astonishing courage. The Brontes' story is not just one of suffering. It's about invention. It's about the unbreakable bond of sisters, of baking bread, bickering, laughter, writing until their fingers would have ached. It's about surviving loss and then absolutely refusing to let your voice be silenced. So the next time you open Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights, do this. Close your eyes for a second. Imagine the parsonage kitchen, the wind at the door, the 3 sisters at their table, writing for all their worth, utterly unaware that the whole world is about to listen, and not just listen for over 200 years. And I think that is the real Brontë legacy. Not the tragedy, not even the books, but the proof, living, breathing, undeniable, that you can start at the edge of the world with nothing but your sisters, a battered desk, and a wild, unbreakable dream, and you can actually make the universe take notice. And I love that that's possible. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.